In June 1924, British climbers George Mallory and Andrew Sandy Irvine disappeared while ascending Mount Everest. 29 years later, Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay became the first climbers confirmed to have reached the summit of Mount Everest. But one extraordinary question has never gone away. Could Mallory and Irvine have done it first? My guest today is Jochen Hemmleb, the historian and researcher whose work helped lead to the discovery of George Mallory's body in 1999. Now with Irvine's boot and foot discovered on the mountain, a mystery that has endured for more than a century has entered a remarkable new chapter. This is the story of two climbers, a missing camera, and the possibility that history may not have happened quite as we believe. Welcome to the show, Jochen Hemmleb. Jochen, it is my honor and privilege to have you with me.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Pleasure is mine.
You are someone who has looked into one of the greatest mysteries of all time, in my opinion. Did, first of all, George Mallory and Andy Irvine, did they summit Everest? And also finding George Mallory's body, and subsequently, obviously, they've now found the foot and boot of Andy Irvine. So you've been right in the kind of middle of all of this. And I really want to talk to you about that, but also about you and your life and who you were as a child. What made you become the person you've become? So I'm wondering if you could just take us back. Who were you as a kid? What did you want to do? What was your kind of aspirations?
Well, looking back all that time, I mean, I'm 55 now, and sometimes now it seems hard to remember how I was as a kid, and you may ask different persons and get different answers. I was probably a bit nerdy as a kid. One thing was sure, I tended to have passion for things, and in particular, this kind of real-life mysteries, real-life detective stories. Even as a child, I never was that particularly interested in fiction. I always found real life a lot more exciting and mysterious. And there was also a personal background that played a role in how I got eventually involved in the Mallory and Irvine story. And that was my father. He had been a climber. He had also been quite old. He was 57 when I was born. And that was the reason, I mean, he started, you have to imagine that, he started climbing back in 1932. And for that reason, he had a lot of climbing history that he witnessed and a lot of stories he could talk about, and he did. And he got me climbing. He got me interested in climbing and hiking when I was 9, 10 years old. And so I grew up with mountains, even though I didn't come from a mountainous region. But I grew up with mountains, and I grew up with mountain stories and mountain history. And that certainly created a fruitful soil, so to say, for who I am now.
I find that really interesting that obviously you had that in your family. One of the things that I find when I get to talk to people is quite often there is an idea in the family. For example, you're going to be a doctor, and people kind of push back against that and become a hip hop dancer, which was one of the conversations I had quite recently. But it's interesting that your father had that climbing experience, and you did follow in his footsteps. And, this mystery that you've become so associated with, it really is one of the most fascinating things that I have ever got obsessed with. And it's one of those things that you go down a rabbit hole with, and you quite easily become all absorbed. You can just feel it. Those people do incredible things now. They summit these mountains, and it was very sad what happened to Nims Purja recently, and the rest of that team that he had with him. But back in the day, going into the 20s and 30s, when they were climbing, that was a different experience, right? We didn't have any of this technology that we have now. The guides, with the experience they have, the ropes and the ladders and the tools and the equipment. So your dad was really in the kind of pioneering part of climbing.
Yeah, you could say that. I mean, when I look at pictures from his photo albums from the 1930s, I mean, it was incredible. No one would go again into the mountains like that. I mean, they had 12 millimeter thick hemp ropes that got incredibly heavy when it rained and then soaked up water, and they had iron pitons and carabiners. It was a different ball game, and in some reason that impressed me. I always said my father climbed one of the highest walls in the Dolomites in the 1930s, and it bivvied close to the summit. And I said, well, if you do something like that, you don't have to have only stamina. You needed to be very clear-headed. And that is maybe what impressed me in general about those pioneers. They were relying not so much on technology, but they were relying on instinct and on intellect. And that's what we constantly still underestimate about the Everest climbers in the 1920s. Sure, they didn't have the equipment, but they were very, very keen observers. They were learners. They observed what was going on the mountain with the weather, with the altitude. And they took that into consideration. And when it comes to 1924, Mallory and Irvine, when I worked on my latest book, The Everest Mystery, that I co-authored with Andrew Irvine's grandniece, Julie Summers, we came to really reappreciate how observant and intelligent those old climbers were, that in some ways they had it nailed down. They took all the knowledge they had, and they had an impressive set of knowledge already back in 1924, and tried to put that to the test. But in the end, they took the risks, and they were stepping into the unknown, but they stepped into the unknown a lot more and better prepared than we generally think they were.
I get that. I know that Mallory, he'd obviously been on Everest before, and also Sandy, my understanding, he was incredible with things like the oxygen and other technical aspects. It would be foolish to say that these people who were on the expedition, not just them, were ill prepared. As you say, they were incredible. And my understanding from reading a bit about Mallory is, he was a brilliant climber. And, he had gone and climbed some things which people said were not possible before. And I find it thoroughly fascinating, way more fascinating than anybody getting up these days. What those early expeditions were they were groundbreaking, right? They were setting the path for everybody that came after them.
Yes, absolutely agree with that. Groundbreaking adventurers, taking risks, taking in the adventure, and that's part of, or major part of, the attraction. Those old stories of Everest have have today. And the question I find always fascinating is, what does this says about us, the observers now, the admirers? Why do we admire those old stories? And I have a hunch in that I think maybe it has to do that we have a more or less subconscious, perhaps even conscious realization that our increasing reliance on technology, I mean, we are talking digitization, we are talking artificial intelligence, etc., somehow alienates us from who we truly are. I mean, we are still human beings. We have our roots in nature, and I'm not a hippie, and I'm not totally tech adverse, but I feel that being constantly subjected to technology and relying on technology, I see that in the mountains. I mean, people using apps and smartphones. Not me. I'm still the old paper map guy, and because relying on simpler things and relying more on our own capabilities, our body capabilities, our brain, our intelligence, keeps us a lot more grounded. And I think we feel that. We feel when we connect to our surroundings more. And technology often acts as a barrier, as a filter that doesn't allow us to truly feel and process our impressions and what we have. And that, for me, this is one of the key reasons why I like going to the mountains, because I like to have that feeling of being grounded again, being more in tune with who I feel I truly am. And that's what I certainly feel in the mountains. I don't know, I don't really feel that when I'm behind the computer, except perhaps when I'm writing. That's also something that comes out deep inside of me. But going out, moving, being alert with all my senses, that feels a lot more natural and a lot more better in the end.
There are some incredible studies that talk about obviously being in the natural elements. There are some really fascinating testimonies of people who embark on, we could call them expeditions, whether it's walking on land across the country or across continents. There is something unquestionable that is closer maybe to the people of our ancestry, going back in time. Obviously, there was none of this technology. People relied on other people. And, if you needed to work out a problem, you had to find a solution. You couldn't Google it or, work out a way through any other means other than doing it yourself or collaborating with someone else to do it. And I think that's beautifully articulate. I think what you said is absolutely true. I wholeheartedly believe that. And
I think that when you expose yourself to nature, when you take risks, I mean, it's not like having a death wish, but taking risks and know that you need to do something bodily to achieve something, that you have the exertion, you have the strain, you have the positive stress, you have the alertness, that expands your consciousness and your perception. And I had one example in one of the many interviews I did with climbers, and one of them said, when I'm in the solitude of Patagonia for 2 months or so, at the end of this, I'm so sensitive, I can sense when somebody is coming to visit 1 or 2 days ahead before it actually happens. And call me crazy, but I truly believe that. I think this is true. And it's not that something changes inside you or that something from the outside or extraordinary happens to you. I think some properties that you have are awakened again. They lie dormant because we don't rely on them any longer in our world of technology, and we have given that responsibility away from us and outsourced it to things like smartphones or something like that. But this high sensitivity that you can gain and regain out there in nature, that is really part of the attraction, because it tells you a lot about human capabilities and capabilities of human perception. And I find that utterly fascinating. And we may come to that later on, but what many people don't realize is that this is something that really drives me to explore that Mallory and Irvine mystery even further.
Do you think that the potential risk that you could come off the mountain not alive, essentially back in those early days particularly, and still now, there is an incredible risk that something like what happened recently, an avalanche or a fall. And I read something and it said that part of the attraction was in part the danger, the fact that this, was dangerous. Do you believe that's true? Do you think there is something in that?
Yeah, I absolutely believe that the danger is part of the attraction, or perhaps not the danger, but more the risk, the realization that you could come to harm there. I don't feel it is necessary to put that to extremes and always talk about the danger of dying in this respect. I think this is the far end of the spectrum, but it definitely plays a role that the experience gets a better quality, a higher quality, when there is an element of risk, a risk that you feel uncomfortable, that you feel cold, the risk that you need to take effort, that you strain yourself, that you get exhausted. And when you get through this, God, it feels good. It really feels good. So this is an element that plays part of the attraction. This is not something not comparable to taking a walk in the park, but even taking a walk in the park is better than just sitting behind a screen. So this comes in stages, and I think it has a lot to do with just exposing yourself and feeling your natural surroundings a bit more. Sometimes it's the small steps that makes a difference, like you're lying in your bed at home and you open the window. It's a different experience when you sleep that way and you feel the air and you feel the temperature and you're not in the climatized room anymore. And so this can expand, not necessarily endlessly, but I think you can take the first steps there and push on further until ultimately, after many, many steps more, you get into the realm where you can really die. On the other hand, and that's what I like to think about, is if you really need to have the risk of dying in order to have those strong emotions or the sensitivity, what does this tell us about our state of minds? Is this really healthy? Is this not also an indication? And I'm only asking this. I don't have an answer. I'm only asking this. Couldn't this also be an indication that we have become insensitive, that we need this stronger impulse to get sensitive again, to feel strong emotions? many, many years ago, a professor of mine, he challenged me with the question. He said, I can really understand what you feel in the mountains and what you do and why you climb on higher summits and so on and so on. But I really think when you think this through, you don't need all of this to become that sensitive. If you get the right mindset and if you become observant and if you become attentive, you can achieve that state even with lower risk or even with no risk at all. And that has stuck in my mind ever since. I mean, I still like to go to the mountains. Ever since having a family, I'm taking considerably lesser risks than I did when I was in my 20s. But I still need to go to the mountain. I need to have this certain degree of exposure to feel alive. And sometimes I'm asking myself, well, what's wrong with you? Do we really need that? And my wife is certainly way more better than that. And she feels completely fulfilled when she is doing regular hikes in the mountain. But again, she also needs the exposure. She needs to be outside. And that's our common ground. And I'm thankful for that.
I love that. That's really interesting. And yeah, that's given me something to think about. That's interesting. And do you know what? I get it. I do. I honestly get it. Part of me thinks, I would love to do more of what you do. I think going out into these spaces and being one with the elements and breathing and hearing more and having your senses engaged, I think those things are incredibly necessary and needed probably more than they ever have been. But you obviously became thoroughly interested in the story of Mallory and Irvine. Where did that interest come from? Where was the first kind of interaction with that story in your life?
Well, the first very tiny roots of that started when I was maybe 6, 7 years old, and I read my first mountaineering books. It was a small pocket book, and there was the story of Mallory and Irvine in there, and in another book, all of a sudden there was the report, Chinese climber had sighted 1 or 2 of the bodies recently, and there are now efforts to recover the camera. And I thought, this is a darn interesting story. It's a mystery of exploration. So I was primed, so to say. And I've now told this story many times over, but it really came down to me to a single moment, and it had a lot to do with instinct and gut feeling. When I learned in 1987 that there was now a book out about Mallory and Irvine called The Mystery of Mallory and Irvine, written by American researcher Tom Halsell and British mountaineering historian Audrey Salkeld, I knew I had to have this. I'd like to know more about this mystery. Maybe I find out more about the state of knowledge with regard to the camera and so on and so on. I mean, Reinhold Messner, when he wrote about his solo ascent of Everest, he also included some snippets of information in his book. So this was all, priming of some sort. And then I got the book. I asked my parents to give that to me as a Christmas present in 1987. And I immediately dove into the book and I read the crucial chapters and switched towards the chapters dealing with the cameras and the clues. Could they have made the summit, and so on and so on. And then something remarkable happened, and I can still pinpoint it almost to the hour. It was December 27th, maybe 10:30 in the morning. And I had read the final chapters, and I closed the book and I reflected on what I had read over the past 3 days. And all of a sudden, I had, coming from deep inside me, this absolute conviction that this story was going to do something to me, that this was going to lead to something in my life. And, you know, you have always this kind of manager seminars or so where they are talk about having a vision or something like that and saying, oh yeah, this is when it started and I wanted to do this. That wasn't the case in my case. I didn't have that vision, oh, I'm going to solve the mystery of Mallory and Irvine. It was more like I just had this absolute subconscious, irrational conviction it would lead to something in my life.
That's
but I wouldn't know what it would be. I only knew it would happen. And nowadays, I'm comparing this to, it was like as if I had cast a fishing line far away into the future and it anchored somewhere there. And now I had a red thread in my life, a guideline that I would follow. And I think Tom Petty put it very succinctly in his song, Running Down a Dream. Running down a dream that would come to me, working on a mystery, going wherever it leads. Yeah. I just wanted to make that journey, my very own journey, with that fishing line as my guideline. And that is true, has true ever since, and is still true today.
I love that. And I can see that. I wholeheartedly believe you. That you know, some people would say that that's destiny. Some people may say that you were, this was always going to happen to you, but you were drawn, whatever happens, whatever articulation of it, you were incredibly drawn to this. And
in the early days, and especially when I became, some sort of famous after the discovery of Mallory, people often try to put the label of obsession on me. I never liked that. It wasn't obsession, and it clearly wasn't like one British reviewer said, he was collecting Mallory's stuff like a train spotter. Interestingly enough, he made that remark without ever having spoken to me. No, I would call that dedication and also intuition. It was not, and it has never been, that I was constantly working on the Mallory and Irvine mystery 24/7, 365 days. No, I had years where I hardly did any Mallory and Irvine research at all because I was interested in other mountaineering stories and I was pursuing my career as a writer and mountaineering journalist. But what remained was a consistency. It was always there. It was always in the background. And whenever something new emerged and I got a new impulse to do something about it, it was right there again. And that's the main difference. To me, that's not obsession.
No, and I think that comment is insulting. I think it's flawed, disrespectful. And quite frankly, the people are better than that, That's that. I don't like that. So I'm going to do something that I don't tend to do unless I know a little bit about it. And I'm going to tell you my opinion. Did they make it up there? And I believe they did. I believe that. It is, my opinion based on, I guess, my desire for them to do it, my understanding of, the last sighting, the fact that George Mallory apparently had that photo on him of his wife and he wanted to leave it at the top of Everest and that was not found. Looking at George Mallory in particular, because I've heard more of his story, and that's one of the great things about having you here today. I just do not believe that that man, being so close to the summit, did not do it. I think fundamentally that desire may have resulted in both of them dying. You know, maybe it was too late in the day and they pushed for it, and that was what happened. But I won't say no doubt, but I have genuine belief that they succeeded. So I don't know, you know, maybe you can tell us whether you think I'm wrong, or if you think that is that a reasonable, logical conclusion, or is that do you think a little bit inaccurate?
I'm not judging you on
That's
that,
okay.
and I perfectly understand what you describe as a personal desire, because I think if they really did, it would make their message a lot more stronger. It would be an incredible feat of mountaineering to have pulled that off in 1924. There's now the rational part of me who considers historical evidence, knowledge of the terrain, knowledge of capabilities, knowledge of equipment, etc., etc., etc. And if I look at that, there are a lot of arguments that speaks against them having done it. And in The Everest Mystery, the latest book, Julie Summers and I have followed that rational trail based on historical evidence and well-measured, well-considered opinions. That's a perfect, sensible approach. Is it the right approach, and is it the only approach? I think there's another approach, and that's the intuitive one. And you consider other impressions, knowledge of their characters, knowledge of perceptions people have had. And then all of a sudden you think, well, okay, we have this rational approach and interpretation, but maybe there's still a different story that can be explored. Anyway, I mean, all of this in the end is not only about what happened to Mallory and Irvine, but it is also about us, the observers, the ones who try to solve the mystery and what it reveals about us. And that's what makes it very, very fascinating, and opens up a lot of fields for exploration that in the end will tell us more, not only about Mallory and Irvine, but about ourselves. And that's what drives me, and that's what makes it fascinating.
If you had to go with your gut purely based on that, do you think they did?
Julie Summers put it very nicely when she said, ask me any day and you get a different answer. It depends on my daily mood. On average, to be perfectly honest, I don't think they made it. But I'd really like to know how high they got. And especially whether they made it past or around that famous second step, the crux portion of the route. Because if they did, that would have been an incredible piece of climbing and route finding for 1924. And so, yes, I'd like to know how high they got and what really happened. And there's still a lot that we don't know. All we can say at present, based on the historical evidence, is that they definitely got to the base of the second step. But we don't know if they went beyond. And if you consider all approaches that I have outlined, there might be indication that they did, that they got beyond the second step. But to prove that and bring those different approaches together, that's really interesting, and that's what I want to do.
So here's a couple of things I don't like, and I'll tell you what these are. Number one, I really dislike this theory that goes around that somehow Sandy was this really weak link. That potentially, if one of them summited, it was Mallory. That perhaps Mallory summited on his own. I dislike that. I think it's unfair. George Mallory was a very smart man, and he picked Sandy. And there is no way, and I do not believe for 1 second, that if something had happened, let's say, to Sandy, that Mallory would have just gone, oh, yeah, there we are, off we go. And, I don't believe that. There's nothing to say that it wasn't Mallory that fell and, it wasn't the other way around. I just think, regardless of what actually happened, it's insulting. I don't like that.
I agree with you on the main part of this, but I think there's some middle ground there. First of all, I agree that Sandy Irvine was a lot stronger than it was believed for a long time. And Julie Summers did a heck of a job in setting the history straight in that regard. I mean, her biography, which we now updated with the Everest Mystery, really put Sandy Irvine in his rightful place in the history. He was adventurous. He was incredibly gifted as an engineer, as a technician working with the oxygen set. But he pitted himself against this challenge of Everest. And for him, it was even more a step into the unknown as it was for Mallory, because Irvine hadn't been experienced at high altitude before. And that might have made a difference in what transpired on that final climb. And as far as Mallory would have left Irvine behind, I think there is still the possibility that he did. But as you said, Mallory was a smart man and he was responsible as the leader of the party. And he might have left behind Sandy, but only under the circumstance that he felt it was completely safe to do so, that he was in a sheltered spot and that he could risk leaving him alone for maybe 1 or 2 hours in order to push towards the top. So I think that is a real possibility that this had happened. But the evidence found on Mallory's body back in 1999 tells us that whatever happened, they rejoined and they went down together, roped, and they had the accident together. So Mallory was not negligent. He didn't leave him behind. But if he left Sandy behind, it was because he felt it was safe to do so.
I think that's a nice way of putting it. Yeah, I just don't like this kind of negligent outlook that he essentially just ditched him and said, see you later. Thanks. I'm off. I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that. So what about this photograph? Could we talk about that? This photograph that Mallory had and did not have when he was found. Do you think there is anything to that?
It is a beautiful anecdote, and it captures the imagination of people. But unfortunately, from the historical evidence, we don't even know whether he really had that picture on him on the final climb. Simply because there was a letter exchange between him and his wife from base camp. And there's one letter surviving that in which he criticizes his wife for having sent a picture of the children, but not of herself. So he was requesting her to send her a picture of herself to the mountain, and we don't know if she did, and if he ever received that photograph. So it remains an anecdote. It remains a beautiful anecdote, but the question of whether Mallory had that photo actually with him is unresolved. However, something else was found on Mallory's body back in 1999, and that was a stack of letters. They were all personal letters, one from one of his sisters, one of his brother, and one of a close friend, Stella. But even though Mallory had corresponded with his wife throughout the expedition regularly, there was no letter from his wife. And I find the absence of a letter from his wife among that stack of letters has probably more significance than the absence of the photograph. And I find that very, very intriguing, very, very interesting, without ever calling it substantial hard evidence. But I find it interesting.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. That is thoroughly interesting. You're going to give me some real thought with that one. So we're in 1999. There had been for a long time these, I'll call them, some of them could have been accurate, some of them were absolutely made up. People saying they'd seen these bodies and just walked past them or spotted them, and you know, the snow had uncovered them, and there were countless that the Chinese or variant other governments had taken them off the mountain. There was all kinds of speculation. There still is about Sandy, because of this camera in particular. And, you know, can we go to that 1999? How on earth did that expedition, how did you go, right, this is where we have a chance of finding, I presume, George Mallory. Was that accurate? You were looking for Mallory at that particular time?
Yeah. No, we were looking for Sandy Irvine, actually.
Okay.
Because there was what was known before 99 was that the Chinese climber apparently had come across what he called an English dead. That came out in 1979 when that particular Chinese climber came into conversation with a Japanese climber on a joint Sino-Japanese expedition. And he indicated to that Japanese climber, sign language, characters written in the snow, that back in 1975 he had seen a dead body at 8,100 meters high on the northeast ridge, that it was sleeping and that the clothing had deteriorated, and when he grabbed the clothing, it was blown away by the wind. So all of this was indication that apparently that Chinese climber had found a dead body, an old dead body at 8,100 meters, and that could only have been Mallory or Irvine, because prior to 1975, evidently only Mallory and Irvine had gone missing high on the mountain at that altitude. And so, of course, when Tom Holzell, the American researcher, got informed, he had corresponded with the Japanese before, when he got informed that the Chinese had made that discovery, it seemed to confirm his belief that Sandy Irvine had fallen down from the place where his ice axe was found on Everest in 1933, down to a snow terrace 300 meters lower, and there he was discovered by the Chinese in 1975. And to make a long story short, what I did prior to the 99 expedition was, I thought, if we could place that discovery of the body a lot more with precision, then we would really have some kind of reference point to start a dedicated search on the mountain. And I noticed there was a picture of that Chinese camp from where the Chinese climber had discovered the body. And I realized that the perspective, the view from that camp was different from other campsites high on the mountain. And from that difference, I could work out a method how to reconstruct the actual photographer's position on the mountain, and therefore the camp's position. And I got a very, very good impression where that Chinese camp was. I think I could delineate its position with an accuracy of about 100 feet, plus minus, in altitude and in spatial distance. So we had a very, very good area where we could start a search. And by that time, I was just doing spare time research as a student, and I published this on the internet, and I put out the question, are there people out there who are really interested in doing a search high on the mountain? And again, to make a long story short, and this has all been written about in my previous books, like Ghosts of Everest, I first got in touch with the BBC because a BBC employee, Graham Hoyland, a relative of 1924 expedition member Howard Somervell, he was interested in doing a search, and he was trying to get the BBC to do a documentary film about it and to finance that search. And I got in touch with him, and we thought about collaborating on this, but I have to say, in time, I didn't came away with the feeling that A, is this project really going to take place, and B, can I be part of it? And with that insecurity, I took on another lead that came from an American, Larry Johnson, who had seen my research in the internet, and he was fascinated by it. And with time, we came to the conclusion, let's try to set up the project by ourselves. And he got in touch with Eric Simonson, who has his expedition outfitting company, International Mountain Guides, and he eventually became the leader of the Mallory and Irvine Research Expedition in cooperation with the BBC. And I became part of his team, a part of the American team. And here we are again with gut feeling. In November 1998, I really felt, I think if anyone gets me to Everest, it's not going to be the BBC or Graham Hoyland. It's going to be the Americans. It was just a gut feeling, because they had been open, they had been honest, they had been trusting by saying, for using your research, we take you along, you become part of this team. And they kept true to their word. And I wrote in The Everest Mystery, I am forever indebted to Eric Simonson because he took me to Everest twice, therefore laying the groundwork for 25, 27 years of mountaineering writing and journalism and filmmaking. And I can truly say, with a look at my own roots, no man has shaped my life except for my father, had shaped my life like that. And I can really publicly say thank you again to Eric.
It's beautiful, honestly. And I'm so glad that you got to do that. But I am going to say, though, that you made a lot of that happen. You know, that there was some serious research, some serious you made contact with people. You were not sitting around waiting for something to happen. You made something happen there. And that credit has to go to you as well. And never underestimate the difference that you've made. Never, because it's one of the most extraordinary finds ever. One of the greatest pieces of history was recovered in the sense of you were able to find and obviously look at the items that George Mallory had on him. And I know Mallory is still in the same place. Is that where George Mallory is still there?
As far as we can say, yeah.
Yeah. And I'm assuming that location or exact location, I don't presume people are going too near that these days.
It could be. It could be. Yeah.
Could be. I think, obviously, one of the things now, all of these years later, they found Sandy's foot and boot. And according to the sock, and it seems, would you say, obviously I know they're going through a DNA and all of that, but is that entirely logical to jump to that conclusion that is indeed Sandy?
Yeah. I mean, when you find a boot and there's a sock in it and that sock has a name tag on it, it seems pretty obvious what we are in front of. The bigger question is, what does it really tell us? That the foot is found on the glacier 3,000 meters, more or less, below where Mallory's final resting place is. And that's giving us a lot of questions that we can't answer now. Not within our talk here and ever. We have dealt with some of these questions in the Everest mystery, but I'm still touched by the fact that the boot is so similar with the boot that was recovered from Mallory. The socks are similar. There is the name tag on it, and we recovered in 1999 the name tag of Mallory from his shirt. This really puts Sandy Irvine on the same level as Mallory. He steps up, and he is his equal partner again. No longer just a sidekick and a footnote in history. And that is very, very touching, very, very moving. And that is something Julie Summers and I often talked about, and especially for her, as a family member, as a relative, it's very, very touching. And if there's any more proof that Sandy Irvine is now in his rightful place in the whole history, it is that similarity of recovered items. He is on a par with George Mallory. They were, in a sense, a pair of equals, more or less. And you have to say, Sandy Irvine, ever since 1999 or 2001, and in particular now, is the carrier of the story. He probably, whatever might be found in the future, carries another pieces of the puzzle. And that is also touching from the human point of view, that this young man, 22 years old, called initially the experiment of the 1924 expedition, may carries the solution to the riddle and may have carried that evidence ever since that fateful day in 1924 and tried to preserve it after witnessing falling his partner to his death. And that's touching, and it creates a very, very powerful story in one's mind.
It does. So if we go back slightly, you mentioned that it is not entirely infeasible that Mallory pushed on. He may have pushed on for a couple of hours, leaving Sandy in a place where he was safe. possibly, and we are heavily speculating here, possibly pushing to the summit of Everest. So obviously the camera was not on George Mallory. It's entirely possible it could have got lost, but the chances are that camera was with Sandy. And I don't know if that makes any difference to the fact that if how they clearly got back together. So whether George Mallory, under that conclusion, would have given the camera back to Sandy, or maybe they made it together and Sandy always had it, or maybe they didn't make it at all. But either way, this camera is missing. If they found the camera, who knows if they could do anything to develop what was on there. Hopefully there's enough technology around today that you'd like to believe that to be true, that they could do something. But do you think in the near future they will be able to find Sandy Irvine?
It seems entirely possible from the location that the body is submerged in the ice and that it will show up at one stage in the near future. Maybe it has already been found. I mean, there have been no news beyond the discovery of the boot and foot and soccer name tag. So we don't know what else happened beyond that in the time since then. So again, we can speculate endlessly, but yes, I think it could be possible that more of the body or the whole body could be found, that maybe the camera is there. With a lot of luck, it has remained intact and something could be done to the film, but it's all maybe, it could be. Is there a probability? We are talking in so many points of the Mallory and Irvine mystery. We talk about probabilities. We don't have any certainties. We just talk about probabilities. So yes, we could also speculate, did he have the camera with him? Is there a chance? Yes, Mallory could have handed him the camera he had borrowed from Howard Somervell. Yes, there's a possibility that Sandy Irvine took a small film camera with him that he had borrowed from Captain John Knoll, the expedition's photographer. He made a reference to that in his diary. He may have taken that camera up the mountain, or maybe not. The evidence isn't conclusive yet, so who knows what will show up in the future and whether we will ever learn about it. So that's the point where we are at. A lot of uncertainties.
One of the things
when you ask me about the poignancy of the camera, I still think a lot more could be gained if further equipment would be found high on the mountain, in particularly above the second step. If that is ever found, that could be a real game changer.
So they recently found the oxygen tank, or a oxygen tank, didn't they? And that was interesting. I think this is one of those mysteries, isn't it? That until Sandy is found, and even then, there will still potentially, let's say there is a camera. Yeah, that would conclusively tell us, perhaps. But obviously, yes, like you've just said, if something was found above a certain level, that would put their chances so much higher than, what is. There are a lot of people who really doubt this, right? The sighting, was it Odell? Was that right? And the second step, they said he couldn't see. It would be impossible. The vantage point, they would be too small. Do you think that he saw what he saw?
Yes, I think what we know of Odell, his near perfect eyesight, his observational capabilities as a trained scientist, I think, and I have always believed him, his own statement, that yes, he saw Mallory and Irvine climbing. But he was never really certain where he saw them. And not so long ago, there was a diary entry discovered from one of Mallory and Odell's colleagues on the expedition, Edward Shabir, and he even wrote at base camp back in 1924 that Odell was uncertain whether it was the first or, to quote Shabir's diary, more likely the second step. I mean, Julie Summers and I, we have analyzed Odell's sighting in our latest book. Again, we have pointed out the various probabilities. The interesting thing is, if you take his sighting verbatim, you take it apart step by step, and you believe this is what he saw, then it fits the third step that is above the crucial second step absolutely best. But from the historical evidence, the whole circumstances of his sighting, putting into consideration the difficulties of the second step, the configuration, terrain configuration of the second step, it fits best the first step. So it doesn't fit one place perfectly at all. So that's another very, very interesting mystery. And in some ways, it's also, again, a thing of belief. It would be wonderful if it was the third step. Well, it was likely the first step, but still that is not entirely clear and right. So
I think the one interesting...
The speculation will go on.
I think one of the interesting things, perhaps, is that it was so late on that particular day, with the light and everything, that there is, some logic that it could be the third, purely based on the fact that if they were pushing, so late in the day, and that would, in my optimistic sense, is perhaps the little piece of evidence I would throw behind that, based on my limited but enthusiastic covering of this wonderful mystery.
Actually, I find it interesting, nice that you point that out, the time of the sighting, 12:50 in the early afternoon. This is very, very late if it was at the first step. But they would have been very, very hard-pressed to have made it to the third step by 12:50. So now we are again back at the second step. It would have fit the second step very nicely. So another factor that muddles the picture. And I can now say I almost like it like that. That you could shift around the pieces of the puzzle and you can fit them in different ways, but there's still no clear answer where I say this is really what happens, this is where they were, this is where they could have gone to, and that's the beauty of the mystery. It keeps the intellectual challenge going.
I think that what you do is extraordinary. I love the fact that you continue with this, and I'm going to put up all the links to the books and the different work that you've done and continue to do. And I just wonder, what is next for you?
In many ways, my latest book, The Everest Mystery, written together with Julie Summers, has been a huge full circle moment for me. I mean, to have written 40 years after being inspired by the story, a book with an actual relative of the two protagonists, that is probably as good as it can get. So it in some ways, it bookends my involvement in the Mallory and Irvine story. I'm not saying that it ends it, but it is a milestone. It is a milestone. There are still some angles of the mystery, the different approaches I talked about earlier. I keep exploring, and in due time, I will probably publish more about this. I have another book project right now, which also bookends my involvement in all of this by taking, after having researched the early history of Everest for so long, I'm now taking at the modern state of Everest in a book. That's all I can say at the moment. And beyond that, I can only tell you again what I said at the beginning, going wherever it leads me. And I know very, very little right now where it will lead me. The only thing I can say, I am convinced that it will lead me somewhere.
If this mystery was solved, if we conclusively knew either way that Mallory and Irvine made it and summited Mount Everest, or if we found out that did not happen, would that end the mystery? Would that bring closure to it all? Would it be as incredible? Would it be as talked about, as profound as this incredible mystery is? Do you still think generations would talk about it? Or would it bring a conclusion to it all?
My best guess is it would be both. It would definitely fix it for history. It would you would get something like a definitive story if there were conclusive evidence. Yet at the same time, this whole story has left behind such a huge legacy. I mean, all those questions that had been going on for years and years, for decades, for over a century. The personal involvements of many people, Tom Holzer, Graham Hoyland, myself, Julie Summers, all the relatives, the long history of Everest. I think this will always be a story that will be told again and again. And that's the beauty of it. But I really think completely hard evidence, conclusive evidence, will be really, really difficult to come by. So for the time being, I think it will still be the great mystery, and that is great because it gives us, everybody who is interested in it, something to think about, something to reflect upon, and that's beautiful. I mean, thinking of Mallory and Irvine, I mean, this is as beautiful as a legacy as they could get, and that's just perfect.
I asked this question once to an investigative journalist, and I said, if you could know the answer, know everything right now, I could give you the entire book on it, bit by bit of exactly what happened with no mystery. Would you accept it? Or would you prefer that the mystery went on? And I'm going to ask you that question because they said, I just want the mystery. That's what makes me excited. That's what makes other people excited and makes other people interested to go on in their life and become, in this case, climbers. And so I'm asking you that question.
That is a really good question. And I've often asked myself, what role in my own personal story did the fact play that the mystery has not been solved and is unlikely to be solved? I've asked myself this quite often, and I think this has been important. Now to your question. if someone would give me a book that tells me everything conclusively in all detail, would I accept it? Yes. Yes, I would. Because I always faced the possibility or thought over the possibility that one day we may find the answer, and we may find it in my lifetime, and then I would have to deal with that. I have been at least twice at a point where I faced the possibility that the story is over for me. Right? In fact, it was 3 times. I was lucky that the story went on, but it was good to think about the possibility, what would I do if I knew everything, and if the conclusive answer was there, and if the story was over. And well, right now I'm at the point where I said to you already, it is a huge full circle moment for me. I wouldn't call it the end of a story, but it is a milestone. And I have to go from there, and I have to think about possibilities, what I will do, what is there, what gives my life a similar pleasure and purpose. I can think of a couple of things. That's the good thing. And I can work on that. At the same time, I'm also ready to accept that probably nothing else will ever give me the same sense of fulfillment, continuity, sense of direction, or whatever. And yeah, I just have to face that. I have to think about that. I have to deal with it. But yeah, that's one of the challenges that comes naturally with it. And I said recently, maybe now the rest of my life has begun, which means there's potential. There's potential for something new, although you and several other people have told me, no, this will never be over, and you will go back to it again and again. Yeah, I might.
Of course you will. Huh? I know you will, but it'll find you. You know, I believe that. I've got a couple of questions which are going to put you not on the spot, as in that they're controversial, or to catch you out. But I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, and I'm quite straight. Do you think that George Mallory and Andy Irvine do you think they wanted to be found? So their bodies on Everest. Do you believe that they would have wanted to have been found?
Yes, I think. And I'm not saying this out of self-justification for all the research, all the expeditions. I'm saying this because of the nature of the characters. I mean, Mallory, he wanted a story to tell to the world, and in a sense, we have added chapter to that story. I wouldn't be boasting that we did it for him, but it certainly is in line with his character, what we know about him. And of course, Sandy Irvine, young, energetic, full of promise for the future. It's only natural that he would have wanted for this adventure to continue, to go on. I mean, it's always interesting to speculate what would have become of him and also of George Mallory had they returned from Everest. But it's certainly true that they would have continued a life of adventure in one way or another. And therefore, they would have liked that we find out more about them, because it continues their story.
So maybe a slightly tougher question to ask. I'm not sure. With what you know about Sandy and George, do you think you would have liked them as people? Do you think that their characters, their personalities, what do you think these people were like? And do you think you would have liked them?
I think I would have liked them. I would have found both of them very interesting, but for various reasons. To me, George Mallory is more a person from the past. And I think I would have found him intellectually stimulating. I could have imagined having very deep philosophical conversations with him, maybe sitting in a fairly posh saloon or something like that. But probably I would have found him slightly aloof. And also, I would probably have had some tough questions for him, because to me, he seems like a person that made himself dependent on success. I sometimes only half-jokingly call him the first Everest junkie. And that is, the older I get, the more I reflect upon the values of mountaineering, also the costs of mountaineering. The more I'm thinking about this, whether this single-mindedness, this drive to go for the summit and this need to reach the summit is actually a good thing. Because I've seen people getting killed by it, and I think to some degree Mallory was killed by it, even though we are not entirely certain whether they simply had bad luck in the end. So yeah, Mallory would have been, to say it slightly, well, snippish, maybe a tough cookie. Andrew Irvine is someone I can find far more easier to relate to. Because he was 22, he was young, he was fun-loving, he was adventurous, risk-taking. Almost anything that you usually do when you are at that age. You try to find your limits, you try to explore them, you try to make experiences. And when I read what Julie wrote about him, all those stories, and we talked about him, it was so often something that I had felt myself when I was 22. All this devil-may-care attitude, the living for the moment, wanting it all, and wanting it all in many times, many measures over. That makes him a lot more approachable to me. And I think he would just be a very good chap to have a beer with in the pub one evening, get really sloshed, and meet again 2 days later when the hangover has gone. Something like that. Just a really good-natured guy, good chap. And even what we know about the sides of his character that are a bit under scrutiny. It is just so natural. He was just acting in such a human way as a 22-year-old, and that makes him just relatable and approachable. So to come back to your question, yes, I would have found both of them very interesting, maybe even likable, and but for different reasons.
Going to take you, because I've got one more question before I genuinely would love you to tell me the things that I've missed. Now, when they found, obviously, Mallory, and you were a massive part of that, he had particular rope burns, rope marks, which, looks like they were obviously together when the fall happened. Who do you think fell? What do you, it appears, and please correct this if it's wrong, that perhaps George Mallory did not die straight away, that perhaps he he was there for a time. And I wonder what you think happened and what you think may have gone through both of their minds when these moments of jeopardy started to happen.
Yeah. As we wrote in Everest Mystery, there is as yet no great unified theory about what happened during the descent of Mallory and Irvine, a theory that explains everything without any contradictions. Let's start with the easiest version. They both fell, very probably at the ice axe site, fell down the north face, the rope parted, and Mallory managed to arrest his fall on the snow terrace at 8,160 meters, and Irvine went all the way down to the glacier. That would explain how their remains came to be found where they were found. But in order for this to be true, you would have to ignore, neglect, or explain away all the reports of allegedly seeing Sandy Irvine's body high up on the mountain. Now, this might be possible or easy in the case of where something was spotted on air photos or telephoto shots, something like that. These could always be faulty in some way. But in terms of eyewitness, especially Chu Jing, the Chinese, who found a body high on the ridge, far away from Mallory's resting place in 1960, that is more difficult. I mean, you could, of course, accuse him of making things up, but I find that hard to believe, having interviewed him twice. So if Sandy Irvine had somehow remained high on the mountain and died there at 8,400 meters, then we have a different scenario. And then we have an accident happening, maybe at the ice axe site, the rope parting, Mallory falling down, coming to rest on the snow terrace, and Sandy Irvine being left behind alone, high on the ridge. Now, in that case, both men were probably aware of their predicament. Now, altitude dulls the mind, and it's a question how much they have felt and thought at the time. But it's easy to imagine, and it's not always the most pleasant thought, that Sandy Irvine was aware. He had seen his partner falling to his death. He was stranded. So he was in the severe situation. He needed to find a way to make it down to the camp, and if he couldn't make it, to find a way to survive. When the way Chu Jing described it, apparently he found a space to crawl into, a crack a meter wide with steep walls on either side that would have protected him from the wind, but not sufficiently to not die of exposure in the end. And how much you feel in that situation is difficult to say, but probably you just slip into darkness at one point and you don't feel much at all, or perhaps even have a pleasant feeling of warmth in the last stages of hypothermia. As far as Mallory is concerned, well, many people have said the way his body was positioned when he was found made it appear as if he had crossed his uninjured leg over the broken one to ease the pain. So maybe he realized that he was severely injured, maybe, or certainly he would die. It's not an easy thought, and one could only hope that in some way the end was merciful somehow eased by the cold?
This is an impossible question to answer. But there are lots of things. For example, there are military people who would say that, if my team are here, I'm never leaving, and I am going to go out in battle. You've got like the captain of the Titanic. I'm not getting off the ship. I'm not. Do you think that George Mallory would have taken summiting Everest and having his end the way it was met? Or do you think he would have rathered fail, go home, and that be the end? And that's an impossible question. And, but it does bother me. It does bother me, that one, because the story was so important to him. He wanted that. And I think he would be furious if he got to the top. And now we're debating this because we're not sure that he actually did it. I don't think he would be happy with that at all. He would want people to know, I got up there. I did that. It wasn't Hillary. It was me. And, that's just my opinion.
Yeah, it's indeed a very difficult, if not impossible, question to ask. And the answer we as outsiders can give probably says also something about our view of Mallory. I mean, there were people back in 1924 who said for Mallory to turn around with the only difficulty past, the second step, would have been an impossibility. He would have pressed on regardless. Others, like Edward Norton, said no, Mallory was a responsible leader of his party, and he would have tried everything to get back safely, back to the camp. And maybe again, both factors played a role in the eventual outcome. The way you get that sort of summit fever and you completely or mostly block out the descent, let's worry about that when we get there, could have played a role, and you keep pushing that away and away time and again until it is probably too late. That could have happened. Or maybe survival instinct kicked in and said, better to have failed and stayed alive. But even then, something could have gone wrong, and the outcome was the same, although the way leading to that outcome was different. We can't tell at present. We can't tell. And as I said, what we think about it says a lot about how we view Mallory. What do we want to see in him? And that is another reason why I'm drawn into this mystery, and I'm drawn towards finding more answers. It's not alone about solving the historical mystery. It is also getting to know the people behind it. And I think, again, this is my personal view, in some cases, and I think that's very much true for 1924, a mountain can become a reflection of a person's character. When you put everything into that climb, the climb and its development and its outcome can reflect your character. It can give answers. Why did you do it? What did you do? And so finding more answers to the mystery is in part about solving a mystery, finding more evidence about what happened, but also it helps us to understand both characters even more. And that's what I find very tempting, very, very, very interesting. I have a favorite author who was one of the main inspirations for me to get involved into climbing and dealing with all the questions surrounding climbing. It's a Scottish novelist, Andrew Grigg. And he wrote a very, very good novel about reconstructing his father's life. And in the end, he has a quotation that I always found very, very inspiring. And he said, when a person dies, it spurs you on to find out more about their lives. And that's their final gift to you, the gift they give through being dead. And that's how I see Mallory and Irvine. I mean, the mystery they gave us is their final gift. And trying to find out more about them, which in turn might lead to finding out more about oneself, is their gift to us, to me, to everybody else who is interested in it.
That's beautiful. I love that. That's really lovely. Was George Mallory good enough, climbing-wise, to make that climb with the conditions, with the technology, the equipment, the time? Was he, do you believe, capable of pulling that off?
Probably. We know as a rock climber, he was very strong. Now it is difficult to compare his rock climbing abilities at sea level with what you have to do facing a climb at extreme altitude. That's a difference. That's two different stories. But I tend to think, even though we now have some sort of idea how difficult the second step is in pure technical terms, he may have possessed the technical capability to climb it. He certainly possessed the intelligence to climb it, maybe resorting to different tactics like a shoulder stand or something like that. Or maybe even find a different way around the second step that hasn't been rediscovered yet. That is still a possibility, and that is still debated. And we have pored over photographs endlessly to find out whether that route exists or not. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But those are all considerations. And so, yeah, I think probably he could have pulled it off, probably, which is not to say that he did, but it was in the realm of possibility, in my opinion.
I think that second potential route is very interesting. From what I've looked at and looked at some photos which tell you nothing, or tell me nothing, put it that way, and what I've read. But yes, it's interesting that that's a speculation.
I can talk a little bit more about the second approach to the mystery.
Please.
And we put one Easter egg into the Everest mystery, and that is Sandy Irvine's sister woke up on the morning of June 8th, 1924, with a jolt and knew immediately in her heart, talking about gut feeling again, that something terrible had happened on Everest. Same day, 200 kilometers away from Everest, wife of cameraman Captain John Noel approached her host and said something terrible has happened on the expedition. It's not concerning my husband, but a friend of ours, and she was convinced of that. And now we're talking about perception. I mean, is there something in such a major event like the death of a person that somehow sends out a signal and that signal can be picked up by someone. I mean, you have dozens of stories of mothers who feel intuitively that their child is in danger or even died. And they sense this over thousands of kilometers. Just one more case. In 2006, I was on an expedition on another 8,000 meter peak in the Karakoram, and my friend and expedition leader died on the summit ridge. And I know and have learned afterwards that in Europe, 6,000 kilometers away, at least 3 persons sensed the event. And 1 or 2 of them weren't even related to that person. So what does this tell us about the capabilities of human perception? That is something I'm very interested in. And I'm researching stories, I'm collecting stories, and that is something when you talk about next projects or next guidelines, that's definitely a road I'd like to explore, also based on some very, very personal experiences I had in the last 30 years or so. And apart from that, well, there's the usual stuff, more books to write, more films to make. I'd really love to return to Everest one more time, not necessarily to do more research, but for me, Everest is a special place, and it's a special place in particular when viewed from a distance. I think the mountain has some aura, something that makes it special, and I can understand why it is a holy mountain to some. So I've now seen the mountain from 3 sides, but I haven't seen it from the east, from the Kangshung Valley in Tibet. And I'd really love to go there. I'm not sure whether Tibet will be open again anytime soon. I'm still holding out. I'm still hoping, and I probably have some 10 years or so in which I could do this still. My background picture, that is the upper part of the east face, which I saw from Nepal, from the Makalu region 3 years ago. So yeah, this is still something I'd like to complete, and maybe then really rounding off my Everest years. They are rounded off a bit, but they could be rounded off even a bit more.
You know, there are stories throughout human history which absolutely back up what you were saying about, if you want to call it a premonition, a message, a feeling, you could, a premonition, whatever manifestation of something that is. There are countless. I mean, there are countless experiences of things like that. I believe we're foolish to ever think we know the answer to everything. I think that's silly. We can't even definitively say how they built the pyramids. It's and we think we've got a grasp on all of these other things, which are, you could call them magical, mystical. There's so much we don't know. And you are an explorer, an adventurer, an incredible mind. And I just wish you the best with all you do, because it's awesome. Talking to you has been a true joy. It's like, as I said, a kid in a sweet shop. I love mysteries. This is one of the greats. You've played a massive part in that. So from my own perspective, I want to say thank you to you.
Well, thank you to you for giving me the opportunity. And what I definitely hope is that what I've said helps to inspire other people, helps them also to undergo their own explorations. And in particular, with the mystery of Mallory and Irvine, it would be great if other people would join this, would expand our knowledge on every road that leads into the mystery. And yeah, if this podcast helps a bit in that, then I'm happy indeed.
Well, you've inspired me, and you will inspire others, and you have inspired countless. So, from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much. It has been a joy to talk to you, and I wish you well. And I hope one day we get to talk again. So, thank you truly.
I'd love to.